Ashman. He's operated the business rarecharts.com online since 2010. He himself began collecting primarily French nautical charts, and then decided to use his tech skills to produce the eponymous business. As Chuck puts it, the whole thing is spiraled out of control. And today, as well as nautical charts, he collects and sells pictorial maps, map-themed posters, blueprint maps, and unusual paper artifacts, which got me, wondering what that could possibly be. Over to you, Chuck. Thank you so much for being patient and for being our, well, what my dad would call Tail End Charlie.
Well, thank you. I want to thank both Mike and Tom for putting this together. And I want to spend the next few minutes telling you about Johannes Lutz and his only surviving nautical chart of the world. It's a new general sea chart of the whole world with increasing latitudes. And basically that means, to him at the time, that meant on Mercator's projection. This chart, as I said, is the only copy of the only chart that Lutz ever made of the world. And it dates to roughly 1707. Next slide. Okay. After a quick bio, we're going to take a look at some of the features, and in particular, one interesting feature that sets it apart from all the rest. Next slide. Next slide. So who was Johannes Lutz? He was a cross staff maker, apparently had some skills, manual skills. He's from Amsterdam, and around 1688, he began an apprenticeship with the well-known bookseller Hendrik Donker. You might have seen some of his nautical charts before. After the apprenticeship was over, Lutz applied for admittance to the Corporation of Booksellers in Amsterdam. And his first application to be admitted to the corporation was rebuffed. Apparently, the board thought that he had spent most of his apprenticeship working with his hands, building and repairing nautical instruments like cross staffs, when he should have been spending his time learning about the bookselling trade. But regardless, he was granted admission to the Corporation of Booksellers in 1693, and he set up shop at the sign of the Young Pilot. And he was on a street with a lot of competition. He had Hendrik Donker, Caspers Lutzman and his family, and Johannes van Keulen. They were all on the same street. So he did have a lot of competition, but apparently he did fairly well. Next slide. While we look at a picture of a cross staff, which is a nautical instrument for determining the height of different astronomical bodies above the horizon, I just want to mention that in general, Lutz's charts seem to be pretty rare. There are some examples out there that are the only examples of its kind. In 1698, Lutz entered into an agreement with Anthony de Winter and Klaus de Vries. They were going to create a 150-sheet chart of the world's oceans. They were granted a privilege around the same time to publish that sea atlas, and it was to be known as the New and Great Sea Atlas of all known parts of the terrestrial sphere. But in 1707, the three people, de Winter, Klaus de Vries, and Lutz, dissolved their agreement. There's no information as to why. Some of the plates were sold and some remained with Lutz and his heirs, who operated the business long after his death. Next slide. Here's a picture of the chart as I found it when I bought it. It was in pretty rough condition. It was laid to linen, it was on rollers, and it was beginning to disintegrate. Next slide. On the next slide, you can see how it looks now after conservation. We had it removed from the linen, laid down to mulberry paper, and hopefully it's ready for another couple of 100 years. This chart is engraved by Van Til, not by Anthony de Winter, who was the engraver for all the 150 charts that were supposed to be in Lutz's atlas. This is also on Mercator's projection. And so let's take a look at a quick look at some of the map's features. First of all, the next slide.
Hold on.
Next slide. There we go. Okay, the title's in 4 languages. This chart came after, at the end, or maybe 30 years after the end of what they consider to be the classic period of Dutch map making. And what this tells us, I think, is that he was trying to appeal to a broader market. He was trying to appeal to the Spanish and to the English and to the French. And so this chart with Mercury representing the god of speed, you can see has a winged helmet and a foot, so forth. And it marked a competitive environment where they were trying to build up their business by appealing to a broader market. Next slide. One of the other features is almost in the center above Florida, you can see Fort Lewis. As far as I know, this is the first chart to mention Fort Lewis, which is a fort built in or right above Mobile, Alabama. It was just built by d'Iberville, who founded New Orleans. And this fort was built in 1702. So if this chart was produced in 1707 or thereabouts, it came just 5 years after that founding of that fort. You can also see a little bit in Florida. You can see that Florida is a bit stubby and shown as an archipelago of islands. Next slide. There's a peninsula, California. It's not an island. And this, I thought, was pretty unusual for the time, but as I went back, I found that there were indeed some other charts of the period with Peninsular California. So this may not set it apart. Next slide. One of the interesting features, and one that was probably part of his attempt to appeal to a broader audience, is he had drawn on his chart or engraved a number of the routes of explorers. So he's got the routes of Magellan and de Mandana, who discovered the Solomon Islands, Schouten and Lemaire. And the last date I can find of any of these passages or explorations was 1707. So that in part is how I'm dating this chart. Next slide. Tasmania. This is the most interesting part for me. In most of the other charts you're going to find of the time period before or after, Tasmania usually lines up right underneath the Gulf of Carpentaria. As you can see, the first line to the left, exactly. That's normally where Tasmania is. But on this chart, for some reason, the Tasmania is shown about 15 degrees of longitude to the east. I can't really explain it, but I can show you on the next slide that most of the other chart makers and maps of the period show Tasmania lined up at the same longitude as the Gulf of Carpentaria. And that includes DeWitt and Halley, Tasman, Van Coylen. And I saw that in Mark's presentation, Vischer had the same orientation. So that's one of the most interesting and puzzling features of this chart to me. That's really pretty much wrapping up my presentation. On the next page, you can see next slide. I just came across this in my research, and I thought this would be kind of interesting as I was trying to understand how Johannes van Lutz fit into the greater hierarchy and organization of Dutch chart makers. You can see that he was on this table at least listed as a book and chart seller and an instrument maker, as was Hendrik Donker, who was his teacher, or the person he apprenticed under. Next slide.
Hold on.
So basically, this is my summary. Printed world charts of the world were pretty uncommon through about 1710. I went and tried to count them up, the individual individual maps that were made. And it seems like there's 30 to 40 sea charts that covered the world up to that time. This is Johannes Lutz, as far as I know, his only world chart and the only example of that chart. Are there any questions right now?
I can't see any.
I have one.
Hang on.
This is Ken.
Here we come.
Um,
Hello.
Chuck, what's the reason for that there were no charts before 1710?
Well, there were nautical charts, but they were very, very scarce. There were 30 to 40 different individuals that produced nautical charts of the world. And why were they scarce? Well, world trade was a lot smaller than it is now. Copper was a lot more expensive, and all these charts were produced as copper engravings. I'm sure there were other reasons, but I can't think of them right now.
You're emphasizing the world, so but there were charts for smaller areas. For example, I think the Portuguese charted Africa much earlier than that.
Yeah, the Portuguese and others, including the French and the Dutch, produced charts of other areas. But as far as the entire world, which would probably be his capstone chart, I would think, for an atlas, there are only maybe 40 different examples in record.
We actually have several more questions here for Chuck. So it really benefits from being last here, Chuck.
Okay, great.
It does occur to me, of course, that Spanish and Portuguese maps were state secrets, charts. Anyway, here's a question. Can it be presumed that the chart's primary purpose was actually for use at sea? That's the first question. And the same person is asking, could you say a little bit more about the engraver?
I don't know anything about the engraver. I haven't done any research there. I can tell you that these charts were probably not produced just for use at sea. As you can see, this chart, if you remember from the first or second slide, I showed you the chart before restoration. It's a 40-inch by 25-inch chart, but it would have been a wall chart at that time, sitting in someone's office or home. So it would not have been used at sea.
Yeah, no, that makes a great deal of sense. Thank you so much for being patient for a start, and then it was well worth waiting for.
Thank you.
In terms of questions, most people have been using the chat function very wisely, and both questions and answers have been flowing as we've been talking. So if you've not been using that function, do have a look to see what some of those answers were. However, as we come to the end, there is the opportunity because again, I think I've thanked speakers, but I also like to congratulate you now as well for your discipline in the way you've shared with us today, as well, of course, as for the content and the substantial interest, which even interested my wife in her role as host of Zoom. And I believe that is the touchstone of mapping genius. So any remaining questions, please ask verbally. So you'll have to unmute so that we can hear them. We won't take long on this because we are near the end of our time, but I don't want people to feel that they could have asked a question and didn't get the chance. Okay, anybody? By the way, I can't see you all in this format, so you have to just basically chuck yourself in. Oh, I can now because Tom has improved things for me. Okay, who have we got?
What was the source for the maps of the South China Sea?
What, from Julian?
No, for the 9-dash line.
Oh, the 9-dash line.
Right.
Are you still here to answer us, Mark?
Yes, I'm right here. Hopefully
I can see you now. Yep.
Yes. So the map that was sent to SCAP, that's the original copy that's actually in the Palace Archives in Taipei. The other maps, the SCAP map of Japan, I acquired in Washington. And then the first map is actually from nansha.org. So it's a hosting site that's provided by the National Institute for South China Sea Studies in Sanya, Hainan Island.
Got it. Thanks.
But the other two, they're only available, as far as I'm aware, in paper format. I've never found them online.
So they were put out by the Kuomintang?
Yes.
Great. Next question. Or is that it?
Yes, I have a question about that 9-dash line map, that subject. And that is, when are some of the earlier iterations of that by the Chinese? When did they decide that this was advantageous to them to make such a claim? Because it seems to diverge from the thinking of who has the right to control the sea that was going on, that goes all the way back to Elden at the beginning of the 1700s. So when did the Chinese decide that they were going to start making claims to the sea this way?
Appropriation of the sea goes back almost 2 millennia that I know of. And that was because salt, along with iron, were both government monopolized products. And so, and that was done so that whenever Chinese traveled out to the periphery, so basically out to the border, but there was no border, they took salt with them because they don't use spices in cooking. And so they were taking government regulation with them. And it's part of that process where you had salt land. And salt land, of course, if it was on the coastline, was at times, it could be tidal ponds, or it could be actually take salt water that was taken out and boiled in pans to produce salt. And so if you look at the character itself in Chinese for salt, in the top, as you look at it, top right-hand corner, you actually find a government official. So government regulation is going wherever the salt goes. And that was part of the process of formalizing territory. And that territory used to produce salt was the first example I can find of the actual appropriation of the sea itself or low tide areas for production of a commodity that was then formalized on land deeds.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting.
And if I could
Okay.
just throw in my 2 cents, because I did the map about the children's jigsaw puzzle maps, that 9-dash line is something that they teach from a very early age, that all of those little specks of land in the South China Sea belong to China, and they put it on maps for children to see.
Yes, and that long history, modern history, apart from claims to, for example, the parasols and Pratis in 1909, actually goes to 1922. And shortly after the Washington disarmament talks, Sun Yat-sen and the Southern government down in Guangzhou was going to lease the parasols for guano exploitation to a Japanese business contact of Dr. Sun's. And the British heard of this and said, no, you can't do that. You've just adhered to the open door in Washington, which is about, in part, Chinese territorial integrity. You cannot alienate any Chinese territory. So the British were directly telling Dr. Sun that the Paracel Islands were Chinese territory. At that time, Zhou Enlai was the political commissar in the Whampoa Military Academy. Mao Zedong was publishing political pamphlets in Guangzhou. And of course, Jiang Jieshi was there as well. Chiang Kai-shek, he was there as well. And so all the modern political leaders of the 1950s and 60s that we see, and Dr. Sun himself, all knew from the British that this area was Chinese. And during the 1930s, the British expanded on that to Macclesfield Bank, to the Spratly Islands, and said, these are Chinese, we want you to develop them. We will loan you the money as official government loans to develop infrastructure on them for meteorological purposes, for other navigation purposes, and for seaplane refueling. So that's where it all sprang from.
Hey guys, we're getting very modern, aren't we? By the way, this is where I'd like to talk about the Sweeting Islands in the South Atlantic. But I do feel that unless we have anything else, we should conclude. Can I see any signs of any remaining questions about different matters? I'm looking at chat. Current questions have been asked. Have I missed anything, Tom?
Well, I have a question for Martin. I'm interested in the tension that certainly was existing in I think we're talking about the 1600s between the church and scientists, and your map seemed to play into that. Was the producer of the map more scientifically minded? And is that why they showed the gods on the four corners?
I don't think so. I think they're just, it's more, I think, biblically in tune with producing the official state Dutch Bible in Dutch. I don't think it really, I don't believe so. I think it's more appealing to that audience, the Protestant audience, which were in the northern and western part of Holland versus the Catholic south and east.
This is the time of the Treaty of Westphalia, and
yes,
yeah. In fact, it was a question from you, Tom. I think I have missed, which was the tension between Copernican and Ptolemaic thinking. Was that you? That somebody asked? It occurs to me on this particular in this particular case that certainly in Britain, you demonstrated that you were truly educated and that you were truly in touch with modern thinking by using classical illusion. So it occurs to me that the Protestants were showing just how with it they were by using ancient Greek and Roman ideas. That was the modern thing to do at the point that Bible was being printed. Wouldn't go down terribly well with certain Protestant sects that were beginning, of course, in Britain, the independence. But the Netherlands did have a kind of intellectualism that they were trying to develop in their religious polity.
Could it be that somebody had this map available and it's just been copied as a convenient and easy way of getting the map into the Bible because somebody else had it in stock?
Jeremy, you always look for the most logical conclusion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I will say that actually, probably 99% of the Bibles if they had a world map, it was with the four ladies of the continents. To have the Greek and gods and goddesses were quite rare.
Yeah, and anything else, guys? My assistant wants to close us down. Anything else? Right. Well, thank you so much for attending. I can see that people are starting to want to be elsewhere. So really appreciate your participation. I trust you've had a good time, whether it be morning or evening with you.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
To see everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
Again.
Au revoir. Bye-bye.
All right, I'm gonna close it down.
Okay, Tom.
All right,
Wow.
I should have the recording. You can tell Mike I'll be working on it.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.